Ladies and gentlemen, I think we'll make a start now. I make it exactly 5:05, which was the time anticipated. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Charles Tannock. I'm a British member of the European Parliament representing London for the Conservatives, and I'm the spokesman both for my national delegation, the Conservatives, but also the group coordinator on the Foreign Affairs Committee. I'm also the Human Rights Subcommittee coordinator for my group. So I've taken a big interest over the years on this very topic. And it gives me enormous pleasure to welcome you all today to the European Parliament. The audience is very mixed. I see people from the diplomatic corps accredited to the European Union, constituents from London, MEP colleagues, members, officials from the European Union institutions, including the Commission and the newly born External Action Service, and so on. So it's a very wide-ranging audience which demonstrates the interest, I think, that the Brussels village, as it were, political village, has in this extremely timely topic. Let me just briefly introduce to you the panel today. Starting on my left is a very distinguished parliamentarian from Estonia, Tuna Kellen, an old friend from my EPP days. We have, and he will be winding up at the end of the debate, we have John Bew, who is the co-director of the International Centre for the Study of Radicalisation at King's College London. We have the president of the Ahmadiyya community, national president Rafik Hayat, Sophia Lemetinian, I pronounce your name correctly, from Christian Solidarity Worldwide, and Farid, who's going to be here just to make a brief intervention when he starts off the proceedings by reading out a message from His Holiness Hadrat Mirza Masroor Ahmad, who's head of the worldwide Ahmadiyya Muslim community, and this is a message that he has sent from his headquarters in London, the mosque in London, as I understand it. So the floor is yours, Farid.
Assalamu alaikum. This is a message from His Holiness Hazrat Mirza Masroor Ahmad, head of the worldwide Ahmadiyya Muslim community. And he says, "Let me first thank all of you for participating in this debate. It is taking place at a time when both religious extremism and right-wing extremism seems to hold the world to ransom, while the man in the street is too preoccupied with the struggle for existence. Although the trend of civilization is toward unity, and it is claimed that we live in a global village, mankind has never stood so disunited. Polarization has beset the world, whether it is manifested in the discriminatory laws of Pakistan, Indonesia or Saudi Arabia that are used to target smaller religious groups, or the laws in Western countries that target manifestations of religious observances, such as the use of the hijab in France or the minaret in Switzerland. One would have imagined that the governments of today, particularly those of the countries that claim enlightenment, would be much more concerned about the growing economic uncertainty that is the cause of concern amongst its citizens, rather than a mere metre of cloth on someone's head. Why should the entire chosen assembly of an electorate sit in a session to debate about this cloth or impose a ban on minarets that are mere cosmetics of a mosque? Such actions cause greater misunderstandings and disunite societies. Politicians need to discharge the trust reposed in them and remove the barriers of misunderstanding and mistrust. Extremist ideology that has an international impact. If the countries do not check such extremism, then it will spread. Today's debate is therefore very valuable in helping us understand how we can preserve our social and community cohesion. Islam is a religion of peaceful teachings whose purpose is to remind man about the rights of God and the rights owed to human beings, and this is the sign of a true religion that is from God. Religion is a personal matter between God and man, and force plays no role in it. In contrast to those who murder in the name of religion, Islam takes the side of every peace-loving group. The words and deeds of those who are rightly guided speak for themselves. They need no force to spread their faith. Force, power and severity can erect walls of hatred but cannot win hearts. They endure persecution with endless patience. They never take the law into their own hands nor create disorder. This attitude can be summed up as love for all, hatred for none. We humans are all mutual neighbours and should become friends to each other, and with pure hearts and good intentions deal with each other kindly. This requires that there should be tolerance and respect for the lives of other human beings. We need to replace fear with understanding instead of retaliation, and display patience and forbearance. Our legislation should prevent hatred and discrimination, and the administration of justice must protect the rights of all individuals. In both religious and secular matters, we should exercise such sympathy towards each other as if we have become parts of the same body. A religion that does not inculcate universal compassion is no religion at all, and a human being without the faculty of compassion is no human being. No religion of the world advocates cruelty or barbarism, because religion comes directly from God, who loves his creation very much. For true peace to prevail, man must return to his Creator. May God Almighty guide you in the right path. That is from Mirza Masroor Ahmad, head of the worldwide Ahmadiyya Muslim community.
Well, thank you very much for that message from His Holiness. I now read out a brief message from Siobhan McDonough, who's the UK parliamentary member for Mitcham and Morden. She's a Labour colleague from London, and she's the chairperson of the all-party political group who are co-hosting this event for the all-party political group for the Ahmadiyya Muslim community in the UK. And I'll read out an abbreviated version of the letter that she sent today, wishing us a successful conference. I'm delighted to send my very best wishes to everyone attending the special EU parliamentary meeting jointly hosted by the APPG for the Ahmadiyya Muslim community about the need to tackle extremism. I'm fortunate to have very strong links with the Ahmadiyya Muslim community both locally in London and nationally. The Ahmadiyya Muslim community is a very active player in the London region, especially in its amazing works for charity, both through its own charity, Humanity First, and through other fundraising organisations like the British Legion. The community's message of loyalty, freedom and peace is an example to all of us and reflects the importance attached to promoting peace and social cohesion in the wider community. The meeting today is a further reflection of that. Britain has a proud record of tolerance and freedom of religion, and across Europe we should continue to uphold people's rights to follow any faith or no faith as they so wish. No one should be persecuted on the grounds of their faith. I therefore hope that the meeting is a success, that we in Parliament are able to work with other Europeans who care about human rights in order to make further progress. My best wishes, Siobhan McDonough. Now there's going to be a message played, I understand, by video from my old friend Lord Avebury, Eric Avebury, who's the member of the all-party PPPG for the Ahmadiyya Muslim community. He's a very distinguished member of the House of Lords. I have worked with him myself on many issues from Armenia to Bangladesh. And he's the oldest statesman in terms of human rights in the second chamber, and I gather he's going to have a video message which will be played to us. I gather you need to wear your headphones because these loudspeakers aren't very clear in this room.
Assalamu alaikum. I'm very glad to have this opportunity of addressing the important conference in Brussels on the rise of extremism and its impact on European security and cohesion, because I think this is an essential subject for the international community to get a grip on in view of what's happening, particularly in countries like Pakistan, where there has been a huge rise of violence, particularly against the Ahmadiyya community, culminating in the vicious attacks on people at their prayers, but also endemic assassinations of people belonging to the Ahmadiyya community and persecution of all those who subscribe to that conviction. But this is not confined to Pakistan. It's an evil that's spread throughout the Islamic world. You see it in, for example, Indonesia, in Bangladesh, in parts of Africa, where these forces of extremism, and particularly an organization called the Khatme Nabuat, has targeted the Ahmadiyya community in an absolutely vicious way, which is contrary to mainstream Islam, where Allah says in the Quran, "There shall be no compulsion in religion." And yet these people are being persecuted because of their system of beliefs, which is based on the principle of love for all and hatred for none, which we would all subscribe to. Now this evil is spreading into Europe, and we see it in, for example, the last elections, where people belonging to the Ahmadiyya community stood as candidates and were targeted by these vicious extremists. The businesses that were run by Ahmadiyyas were ostracized and boycotted. The broadcasting authorities have been looking at particular cases of incitement to violence on the media, which have spread from Pakistan, and where unfortunately the law does not tackle incitement to violence of an extremist and religious nature in the same way that our law does here. So I believe that this conference has to focus on what international measures can be taken, particularly to combat the roots of this extremism, which are based on, as I say, an ideological perversion of Islam based on the teachings of Qutb and Maududi, who I'm afraid have diverted some people in Islam from the message of peace and love which Allah has enjoined on everybody in the world. So unless we get to grips with this, it's going to harm the cohesion of our own societies and have an impact on our relations with the rest of the world, and on the ways in which Pakistan, Indonesia and so on can move forward in a peaceful and orderly manner as part of the world community. So unless this conference finds solutions to that enormous problem, I'm afraid the situation will get worse, and we need to focus the attention of our leaders on how we move forward to combat this rise in extremism.
Well, that was a serious challenge that Lord Avebury is making to us, to find solutions. We certainly know, we can certainly identify the problems, but finding the solutions, I think, is far more complex. But we'll certainly, in the course of the debate, which we will now start with our first speaker, try and look at some of the ways in which we can address these very serious problems. My first speaker is Rafiq Hayat, who is the national president of the Ahmadiyya Muslim community in the UK, and he is going to speak to us about religious persecution in Pakistan and what feeds extremism. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Charles. Firstly, can I just thank Charles for organising this debate here in the European Parliament. A similar debate was organised in the House of Parliament in the United Kingdom recently, and again that was also very well attended by various interested groups. Firstly, can I just, for those of our guests here who do not know who the Ahmadis are, the Ahmadiyya community basically is a Muslim group. Like all major religions of the world are expecting the coming of the promised reformer or the promised Messiah. We, the Ahmadis, believe that the promised reformer has come. He came just over 100 years ago in a very small town in India called Qadian. And from those humble beginnings, the community has now spread to over 200 countries around the world and has huge membership in millions throughout the world. Today we are here to discuss the issue of extremism. In order for us to understand extremism, we need to look at the root causes, and we need to understand how it all started. And I've got to take you back in history slightly. When the various countries were getting independence from the colonial powers, Asia was one of those countries, and there in 1947 Pakistan was created. Now, Pakistan was created, and the Ahmadiyya Muslim community played a very important role in the creation of this country. And indeed, the first foreign minister of Pakistan was Sir Muhammad Zafrullah Khan, who was a member of our community. And also, the first chairman of the Kashmir community was then our Khalifa then, our leader then, who was the second Caliph. So Pakistan had a very important role as far as the Ahmadis were concerned. And indeed, because our community consisted of well-educated people, in the initial stages, in the hierarchy, in the civil service, in the judiciary, and in the forces, Ahmadis played a very, very important role. And this continued until Bhutto came to power. And indeed, Bhutto was very close to our community. But then, coming under the influence of the extreme mullahs, Bhutto decided that he would declare our community as non-Muslims. And this is where the whole problem started. At that stage, Bhutto was a secular leader. He had no interest particularly in religion, and he came under huge pressure from the mullahs to declare us as non-Muslims. Then, after that, he appointed somebody to head the armed forces, General Zia. And General Zia was a fundamentalist. He decided that he would take power. I think I'm just repeating what we already know. And of course, we know what happened with Bhutto. But when Ziaul Haq came to power, he decided to enact certain ordinances to the Pakistani constitution, which not only declared us as non-Muslims, but it meant that we could not even practice our faith in that country. We were non-citizens in our own country. And even to say Assalamu alaikum, which is an Islamic greeting, can result in Ahmadis getting a 3-year prison sentence. Unfortunately, at the same time as the creation of Pakistan, and I would say that when Pakistan was created, it was created with a lot of hope, because it was supposed to be a secular country where, of course, Muslims principally reside, but every group was going to get freedom, and those were the aspirations of the founder of Pakistan. And if you look at the early history of Pakistan, you will find that it was a country where everyone lived in peace and harmony. It was a country where the people were happy. But look at it today. Today, nobody is secure in that country. And what is the reason for that? In order to understand that, we have to look back in history. What happened was that at the same time that Pakistan got independence, the Middle East was also getting its independence. And at this stage, Saudi Arabia was also going to get independence. And when the British decided to give independence to Saudi Arabia, they went to the largest family there and decided to negotiate a deal with them to try and see if they could secure their resources of oil from that country. This was rejected, and then they turned to the second family, which is the Saud family, who are currently in power, and made the same offer to them. And the Saud family accepted the offer. But at the same time, there was a gentleman called Wahab, who was a radical Muslim scholar, who said to the Saudis, if you get power, then we should combine forces, and the only condition I impose is that we should have Wahhabism as the state religion. Now, Wahhabism is a fundamental type of Islam. And what happened was that they then decided to export Wahhabism to other Muslim countries, and particularly Pakistan. And in this respect, when Pakistan was originally created, there were only 200 madrasas in Pakistan. But now we have over 20,000 madrasas in Pakistan. A lot of them are financed by the Saudi authorities. Now, Bangladesh at the same time also got its independence. Bangladesh also is a Muslim country, but it took a slightly different route. And in Bangladesh today, we also, I'm told, have some 60,000 madrasas. But the difference between what has happened in Pakistan and what has happened in Bangladesh is that in Pakistan, the madrasas, which are principally funded from the Middle East, do not teach a secular curriculum. It is fundamentally they teach a message which unfortunately is that of hate. And that is hate against other Muslims, hate against Christians, hate against other groups. And that message of hate that has been taught in those madrasas, unfortunately now is manifesting itself in the disorder that we see in the Pakistani society today. And what is happening in Pakistan, and I think some of you probably do not always get the news on a daily basis, but Pakistan is in chaos at the moment. There are target killings on a daily basis. Our community particularly is being targeted, and there are lists being drawn up by, as Eric mentioned, by members of certain groups in Pakistan, and people are being killed on a regular basis. More recently, we had 2 attacks in mosques, in our mosques, where over 100 people were just massacred in front of the cameras. And over 100 people were injured as a result. And unfortunately, the authorities in Pakistan either are unable to or unwilling to do anything about it. But this now is not only remaining with the Ahmadiyya community, the issue is that also now other communities in Pakistan are being targeted. Other Muslim communities, the Christian communities, the Hindu communities. And unfortunately, this is going to go to a worse situation unless we deal with it. But one other major thing that is happening is that whereas Saudi Arabia wanted to export Wahhabism to the Muslim countries, Pakistan is now exporting its own type of extremism to Europe. We now are seeing a proliferation of television channels where fundamental Maulvis are coming and propagating the same message of hate that was being propagated in Pakistan openly, has been propagated through the airways in Europe. And unfortunately, the authorities here, I mean, one of the great things about the West is that we have freedom of speech. And whilst we want to allow everyone to speak freely, but this freedom of speech can come at an expense. Because if we do not temper it, then what is going to happen is that the same extremist philosophy that has been spread in India, Pakistan, and those countries, and again it's also been exported to places like Indonesia. Recently, we had 3 callous murders of Ahmadis in Indonesia, where in front of the cameras, they completely destroyed the people. So it is very, very important that unless we are able to deal with this immediately now, the extremism will eventually spread to the West. We have already had 7/7 here. We have had 9/11. Unfortunately, what we do in the West is we actually bring everything under the one heading of Al-Qaeda. I think it is wrong for us to just lump it together under Al-Qaeda, because I think that means that we do not know what is going on. there are various interested groups with various agendas, with various targets, who are performing their own agendas on a global basis. And unless we understand what their agendas are, unless we are able to tackle them, and if we continue to give them an open rein, then we will not be able to tackle extremism. But at the same time, countries like Saudi Arabia have a responsibility to ensure that what is taught in madrasas, which are being financed by them, is not a message of hate, but a message of peace, which is what Islam stands for. And what they have done in Bangladesh, at least, is they have tried to change that. And they're not allowing the message of hate to be taught in their madrasas, even though they have 3 times more madrasas in Bangladesh. So my message to the forum here today is, let us find ways in which we can bring the true message of Islam to the people of this world. And the true message of Islam is that of peace, that of freedom of conscience, freedom of religion, loyalty to the country that you live in. And this is the message that will change hearts and minds. Our message to the world is love for all, hatred for none. And if all the Muslim groups adopt this message and truly practice it, then I think we can bring about change. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Rafiq, for that excellent introduction and that full and candid expose of the problems and the challenges we face, and also telling us a little bit about the history of your community, which for many in the audience who may not know that much about the Ahmadis. I was always of the view that you only had a total worldwide community in the number of hundreds of thousands, perhaps a million, but I understand in Africa alone now you have in the millions now, so you are a major force in terms of numbers, particularly in the African continent. So your message is a very poignant and powerful one for us to think about. The next speaker on my list is Dr. John Bew, who is the co-director of the International Centre for the Study of Radicalisation at King's College, University of London. He will be talking to us about the ideological roots of radicalisation. The floor is yours, John.
Thank you. First of all, I'd like to thank the Ahmadiyya community for their invitation to speak today. It's a pleasure to sit alongside so many distinguished panellists, and it's a testimony to the community that they continue to play an active and a bold part in addressing the issue of extremism in the UK, and I've seen that firsthand, but also taking it to the European stage as well. As you've heard, I've been asked to discuss the ideological roots of radicalisation, to which end the first thing I should say is that I'm immediately entering controversial terrain, not only controversial among academics, and that's my own personal background, but also in terms of the public policy debate with policymakers, counter-terrorism officials. This is relevant, controversial and problematic stuff. When we talk about the origins of extremism, there's a tendency, and this happens quite often, to simplify the debate about root causes of extremism between those on the one hand who ascribe the problem of extremism to economic or political grievance, and those on the other who say everything is about ideology. It's about ideology, stupid. Now, if you're really to push me personally, I would probably be on the ideology camp. But I do think that would be to do a disservice to both the complexity of the issue and also to the institution I represent, and most importantly to the complexity of the debate we're having today. So that's my first big point, if you like, and it's a relatively boring one, if you like, but I think it's an important one to make, which is that the complexity and the variety of what we're talking about today should be stressed at every opportunity. There are no simple answers. But let me expound on that a little bit and put some flesh on the bones. When I spoke to the Ahmadiyya community in the United Kingdom Parliament, I was given a series of questions which the organisers thought might be useful to discuss, and I want to use those to frame my remarks again today, and hopefully end by saying something which might spark a little debate or thought. The first question is, why in Europe do some apparently well-integrated and second-generation youth become attracted to extremist views? How are they influenced? Now, in terms of recent trends, the key thing to consider here is the westernisation of extreme Islamist ideology and strategy. That is not to say the ideology has taken up a Western persona in any means, and we heard about its Wahhabist roots, but it has been made increasingly relevant to the experience of Muslims living in the West, whether that be European countries or the United States. And on a strategic level, Al-Qaeda and its affiliates and sympathetic groups have effectively used Western means to transmit their ideas, most obviously the new media and the Internet. So the main concern for jihadist recruiters in the West is to make Salafi jihadi ideology immediately relevant to possible recruiters in those countries. Thus far, the evidence shows that the most convincing aspect of this ideology, and the notion which has gained most traction, is the idea of a war on Islam being perpetrated by Western governments, whether individually or collectively. And the majority of homegrown radicalised cases, when someone moves from radical ideas to violent action, have that common component. So this war, they argue, this war in Islam, is evident in every European Muslim's everyday life. So on the one hand, you have a foreign policy, and you can think back to Mohammed Siddiqui Khan, who was the ringleader of the London bombings, the 7/7 bombings, in terms of criticisms of the British government's actions in Iraq. And more relevantly, I think, on the other hand, you have smaller scale, but in many ways less remote issues which are relevant to the experience, the everyday experience of Western Muslims. Anything from the arrests and convictions of Muslims on terrorism charges, like we had in the UK just yesterday in Birmingham, to the banning of the hijab in France, and to, of course, the Muhammad cartoons controversy. So all lumped together, this is presented as incontrovertible proof that this war is ongoing and escalating. And against this background, of course, young Muslims who wish to properly practice their religion and to please God are told through this extremist messaging that jihad is the pinnacle of Islam, the most praiseworthy act a Muslim can take part in. And so what you have is a process whereby the ideology and the sense of grievance converge. This, of course, only happens in the very small minority of cases, and I think that is important to bear in mind at every point. Now, in terms of strategy, an extreme Islamist strategy, what has become clear since 9/11 is the fact that the Internet has proven by some distance to be the most effective tool for the spread of this ideology. We talked about madrasas in Pakistan, but that, of course, is not so much the case in the United Kingdom and the rest of Europe, where their presence and the message and the sheer number of them is much less, of course. The majority of British, European and American Muslims who have recently been arrested or convicted on terrorism charges have admitted or have told about their experience of being introduced to these ideas through the Internet. And significantly, Al-Qaeda and its sympathisers and its affiliate groups have proven to be far more effective in their use of new media and the Internet than their enemies and their critics, and even their near rivals. And this is mainly down to their understanding of strategic communications, which has led to the production of numerous online magazines and forums that ceaselessly discuss the religious duty of jihad for all Muslims. So in one sense, it's quite simple. It's not rocket science, and the messages are simple, and yet this is very important. It's strikingly obvious that the most effective Muslim critics of Al-Qaeda-ism and Al-Qaeda ideology have yet to harness the Internet and new media as effectively. So thousands of pages of scholarly recantations, of Islamic critiques of this ideology don't really do the same trick when it comes to disseminating a simple message. You could say, and many analysts do say, that the battle for cool and the battle for the youth is being won more effectively by extreme messaging. So what is this message at source? What about the next stage? What about when this message crystallises? How does the radicalisation process develop thereafter? Well, once again, the sources of authority and guidance for those in the West who argue for these ideas vary. But once again, we have undoubtedly seen a huge shift towards the Internet as a source of justification. So whereas in Britain, to use one example, before 9/11, the main source of these ideas was cause. Certain mosques in the centre of London, famously the Finsbury Park Mosque, there's been a shift to a new environment and a new community of extremism, and that shift has gone from the mosque or certain mosques towards the internet. And with these extreme preachers, all their work is now freely available on numerous sympathetic websites, in many cases on websites as mainstream as YouTube. Currently, of course, Anwar al-Awlaki, the US Yemeni cleric, is considered to be one of the main influences on Salafi jihadi thought in the West. And people like al-Awlaki aim to convince young Muslims who are eager to properly understand and practice their religion that violent jihad is the pinnacle of Islam, the most praiseworthy act a young Muslim can take part in. More importantly, they also normalise jihad in the sense that they claim it's an important aspect of worship as prayer or fasting or going on Hajj. So al-Awlaki's interpretation of defensive jihad allows Muslims to carry out attacks in Western countries as legitimate acts of defence, as well as in retaliation for perceived Western atrocities against Muslims in Iraq, Afghanistan, Palestine, Somalia, Yemen and other places. And as well as providing potential recruits with access to these works and ideologies, the internet, through its forums, through its online community, also provides them with access to a like-minded social group, which can help bolster their belief in the cause and reassure them that they are not alone. Any sociologist will tell you that that's a crucial process in the crystallisation and the formation of a political idea. So the social network really comes into its own as a driver towards violence, that only after the initial seed has been planted. When it comes to the next question that was posed to me, what can Muslims and Muslim groups like the Ahmadiyya community do, as well as state and society, to counter this extremism? Well, that's the most difficult question of all. First of all, when it comes to Muslim groups, the first thing to say is there is already a huge amount of very effective and excellent work being done, and this event is an example of that. There are no decisive arguments which knock over extremist views like Skittles. Extremists have a very simplistic worldview, but that also means it's a worldview which is hard to dent or to break down bit by bit. And like any narrative, it is binary and teleological. So therefore, those who offer alternatives to the narrative have to engage in an attritional, gradual form of debate. Ceaseless and consistent, if you like, even if it sometimes seems hapless and hopeless. There will be no knockout blow. But that doesn't mean that extremists should be given the space, whether in the public or online, without challenge. Because a quick Google search at any stage of a concept like jihad will show you that extremists have a monopoly and a greater internet presence than their actual weight in terms of numbers and influence. And I think that is an important thing that needs to be taken into account. What I would say is that groups that counter this extreme message should continue working, as many do, towards reconciling Islam and Europe, or Islam and the West. Explain that a person can be both British or French or German and Muslim without diluting any of the core aspects of either of those. For example, it is often Muslims who point out the many advantages and freedoms which Muslims living in the UK or Europe have, which are not available to many of those living in other parts of the world. And we've already heard some of those concepts like freedom of expression, freedom of conscience. There's a tougher side to this as well, which is to accept, as many have, that there is a small but a significant number of Muslims in Europe who wish to do harm, and to cooperate with police and security and services appropriately. And I think that that aspect also has to be acknowledged. Finally, there is a need to reject and undermine ongoing conspiracy theories about 9/11, about 7/7 and the idea of a war on Islam. It is a conspiracy theory culture, I think, above all, which continues to bedevil Pakistani politics and Pakistani development. I think that has to be said. And next, there's a final broader point to make about society and the role of media specifically. The standard of debate has improved immeasurably in the last 5 years, but we are still skittish and nervous and wrong-headed in the way we address these issues so many times. So on the one hand, the media, by which I mean the general mainstream Western media, should be responsible in its reporting of Muslim matters and not sensationalist. you get the impression from some British tabloids that extremists like the group Al-Mujahirun, for example, are genuinely representative of European Muslims. Work by our think tank has shown that by and large they get a maximum 100 people turning up at their events, but they're very good at getting headlines. So it's certainly not the case, and seems to be the best example of a self-fulfilling strategy, if you like. On the other hand, critics of extremist Islam should be allowed to express their thoughts without being labelled Islamophobes or bigots. And this is already changing, but it needs to continue to do so. So more effort should be made to inform public opinion and discourse about the problem, explaining more clearly, for example, what is meant by Islamism as opposed to Muslim or Islam. The final question I was answered, which I'll touch on briefly because I can't really answer it in a forum like this, and in fact no academic can answer it, which is what turns someone from violent ideas to violent action. The bottom line is that there's no simple answer. Each case matters differently. But the crucial thing to consider is, in all the cases, the milieu. The wider network that an individual operates in is crucial. Now, we cannot change an individual's mind in every instance. We cannot conquer ideologies or suppress ideologies that are out there. That is not the nature of what Europe does in any of its constituent parts. But we can examine, think more about and challenge the milieu in which extremist ideas take hold and take seed. And that really is a broad brushstroke approach, but I think one that's not said enough. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you, John, for that excellent summary and some very challenging food for thought. And I think actually you've also sketched out some of the answers to the questions posed by Lord Avebury in his message. My next speaker is Sophia Lemetinen from Christian Solidarity Worldwide, who's going to speak to us about extremism and religious persecution from an international perspective. The floor is yours, Sophia.
Thank you very much, Honourable Chair, all speakers, ladies and gentlemen. May I express my gratitude, first of all, to the Ahmadiyya Muslim Association UK and to our host, Charles Tannock, for organising this extremely timely debate on religious extremism. I'm most grateful for being here today and for the opportunity to discuss this topic with you. As Charles already mentioned, my intervention is entitled Extremism and Religious Persecution from an international perspective. I will first say a few words about the scope of religious persecution in today's world, then give some arguments on why it is important to address this challenge at various levels, and finally come with a few examples and also recommendations on the way forward, both in terms of reactive, short-term responses and strategic long-term ones. By way of introduction, let me say a few words about Christian Solidarity Worldwide, the organization I'm representing here today. CSW is a human rights organization specializing in freedom of religion or belief through research and advocacy. We promote this fundamental freedom for all, and this includes obviously the right to believe or not to believe, in line with international human rights standards. In our daily work, we come to grips with religious persecution in its different forms, including religious extremism, which I understand as a tendency to favor or resort to immoderate, uncompromising, or fanatical methods or behavior. Unfortunately, religious persecution is not a historical remnant, but it's very much a contemporary phenomenon, resulting in widespread human rights violations around the world. According to the American think tank, the Pew Forum, high governmental and societal restrictions on religion occur in more than 60 countries in the world. But given that these are densely populous countries, 70% of the world's population actually live in countries with high restrictions. Restrictions on religion mean here a wide variety of efforts trying to curb the free enjoyment of freedom of religion or belief, ranging from legislative restrictions to discriminatory policies, and in most extreme cases, including acts of religious hatred and violence. There also seems to be a worrying trend that countries which already have high restrictions on religion tend to become more restrictive over time. So why is it important to address restrictions on religion, and what relevance does it have for addressing religious extremism, which is our theme today? Well, first of all, we talk about a very widespread problem. All continents have reported cases of restrictions on religion, and all faith groups face restrictions in some form or another in certain parts of the world. I think for this reason, religious persecution needs to be addressed, taken into account at global and local levels. Second, restrictions on religion result in increased levels of violence and instability. This is actually a key finding in Brian Grimm's and Roger Finken's recent study on religious persecution and conflict in the 21st century. They argue that imposing control on religion will actually not curb religious violence and maintain social order, as one could think, but that the opposite is true. So when religious freedom is routinely denied, violent religious persecution and conflict are common. And I think this is a very important finding. The contrary is also true. So if there is free enjoyment of religious freedom for all, this will increase stability, security, and societal harmony. I would now like to give a few examples of the type of challenges that my organization faces in its daily work. We follow the religious freedom situation in about 25 countries and have to deal with different historical, political, cultural, and religious settings. For instance, we document religious freedom violations committed by communist regimes like North Korea, theocratic states like Iran, and military juntas like Burma. I think a common feature for these countries is the authoritarian nature of the regime. We also monitor social hostilities against religious groups in countries such as India, Nigeria, and Colombia, just to give a few examples. I've chosen to say a few words about Indonesia here, not because I think it's the worst example or because I want to single it out. I do this because we already had the example of Pakistan, and I think that Indonesia is an interesting example because it's the largest Muslim majority country in the world and an important regional and international player, and because of its long history of inter-religious coexistence. For those of you who are not familiar with Indonesia, but I think there might be many who are, the country has a long tradition of pluralism, and it's enshrined in the state philosophy called Pancasila. So Muslims, Christians, Hindus, and others have coexisted peacefully since centuries. Indonesia has also gone through a remarkable transition from authoritarianism to democracy. However, we think that Indonesia's pluralist society is increasingly under threat by vocal, violent Islamist minority. We have been able to note an increase in religiously motivated violence, coupled with unhelpful developments at legislative level during the past years. So under pressure from Islamists, the government banned the dissemination of Ahmadiyya Muslim teachings in 2008. And we heard about the case before. This has actually not helped to silence extremist voices, but violence has increased instead. The violent mob that attacked 21 Ahmadi Muslims, killing 3 in West Java in February 2001 is one example. I think it's worth to mention here that in July, these 3 men who took part in this brutal attack were sentenced to between 3 and 6 months in jail. CSW regards these sentences as astonishingly lenient and believes it calls into question the whole integrity of Indonesia's judicial system. And it also gives the green light to extremists to continue their campaign of hatred. We met with survivors of the attack in May in Jakarta. And I've left some press releases at the back so you can take after the event. However, it's not just the Ahmadiyya Muslim community. Christians are also under pressure. Radical Islamists have forced churches to close and created a climate of fear and intimidation. According to the Setara Institute in Indonesia, 91 violations of religious freedom were documented in 2010, at least 75 of which affected Christians. So what's happening in Indonesia is not only a threat to religious minorities, but equally a threat to moderate and secular voices in society. It's a threat to pluralism, democracy, and fundamental freedoms. Some Indonesian think tanks and NGOs do a remarkable work, and I want to praise them here. I'm thinking in particular of the Liberal Islam Network and the Wahid Institute, with whom CSW cooperates closely. They intend to show an alternative to religious extremism through their commitment to pluralism and mutual respect. I think these voices need our support. If Indonesia goes the wrong way, we fear there will be serious ramifications for the wider world. I'll now move on to the responses. So what can be done to respond to this global and transnational challenge of religious persecution and extremism? We already heard here that it's a very complex issue and it's difficult to address it. And I must say that I don't think there are any quick fix solutions. But I think there are a number of short-term and long-term responses that we need to take into account. First of all, reaction is needed when religious persecution or extremism occurs. It is crucial that criminal acts are properly addressed under criminal law and that perpetrators of religiously motivated violence are swiftly brought to justice in order to avoid that a culture of impunity emerges. I think sentences need to reflect the gravity of the criminal act, and states need to ensure that proper protection and compensation are given to the victims of violence. I think the case of anti-Ahmadiyya violence mentioned before, these sentences were just too lenient and it gave a wrong signal to the Indonesian society, hence laying the ground for further violence and impunity. In this context, let me stress that while it is important to hold criminals accountable, this does not mean criminalizing religious behavior altogether. I think it's an important point. Instead of banning religious groups, states should ensure that individuals who committed criminal acts are tried in line with provisions in criminal law. And I also think in the case of Indonesia, Jakarta should repeal the Ahmadiyya decree, since banning this group won't solve the problem. Equally, it is crucial to intervene in hate speech or rhetoric, whether disseminated by media or community leaders. For instance, in Pakistan, you probably know, under Section 3 of the 1965 Misuse of Loudspeakers Act, the use of mosque loudspeakers is limited to the call to prayer. However, this law is not being implemented nationwide, and loudspeakers are sometimes used to rally mobs against religious minorities. So we have laws in place, but the question is how to implement them. In order to pursue justice, there equally needs to be training of law enforcement, police and judiciary, so that they can identify religiously motivated violence, strengthen their capacity to deal with such cases, and be fully aware of the rights of the victims. However, I think that meaningful change is only possible through long-term responses. There is a need to invest in nuanced education for all, including girls and women, and making sure that the national curricula or learning material do not include prejudices of any religious faith or minority group. It is important to invest in conflict and peace research, and I also think it's important to support initiatives for meaningful communal and interreligious dialogue. There are a number of interfaith groups acting at different levels who aim to foster a culture of peace and mutual understanding. I think of the Catholic lay movement Sant'Egidio, which has been involved in several conflict resolution settings, and also the Religions for Peace movement, which brings all the major faith traditions together in a corporate way. To take the example of Indonesia again, more investment could be made in counter-extremist initiatives run by organizations like the Wahid Institute. So now, following these general remarks of short-term and long-term responses, I would like to say a few words about recommendations to this building and also to the European Union. I think the EU should promote an understanding of freedom of religion or belief as a positive value in its relations with third countries, stressing that this is a prerequisite for stability and comprehensive security. And in this regard, I also think that the EU should upgrade its current action plan on religious freedom to a fully fledged toolkit, which would actually give the tools to EU delegations worldwide to monitor and report and also try to prevent and address religious persecution in its different forms. I also think that the EU should set up a unit within the European External Action Service to analyse the role of religion in contemporary societies and international relations. This is actually a recommendation that this very House made in a resolution in January this year, and many civil society organisations have advocated for this cause as well. I think the European Parliament should continue to request the EU to build up capacity for analysing religion or belief, not only in the EU's external relations but also in its internal policies. And I think it would be good if there was a group that was set up of analysis and action, and my understanding is that there have been initiatives in this direction already. However, in all these efforts, I think it is crucial to avoid simple dichotomies. Religion is not bad or good per se, nor is it static or monolithic. Religious behaviour and belonging change over time and space, and it's very dynamic. So policy analysis need to reflect this understanding of a constantly evolving phenomenon. So in conclusion, why do we need to address religious persecution and extremism at different levels? Extremism is above all a system of fear. The fear of the other, of the new or modern, or of the different or diverse. It doesn't have to be all of this, but it might be one of these aspects. Extremism also instills a climate of fear and intimidation. And I think where there is fear, there is no mutual respect. I think we need to pay attention to the early signs and to pay early attention to the slippery slope of religious intolerance and dislike, which can easily transform into discrimination and hate crimes over time. I would like to finish with the thought-provoking quotes by academic author Mahmoud Mamdani. You can turn the world upside down, but fail to change it. To change the world, you need to break out of the worldview of not just the cat, but the rat, not just the settler, but the native. End of quote. I think this is a good reminder for all of us that in order to address religious extremism, or any other worldview for that sake, there is a need to understand the other, including the motives behind and the possible grievances, or reasons for grievances. But perhaps even more important is to remember that personal and societal transformation is possible. However, it takes time and requires individual and communal willingness. So we need long-term commitment to build societies based on mutual coexistence and respect. And I think that all of us can play a role in this exercise. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you, Sophia, for those extremely thoughtful words. And I think you summarised it beautifully by saying there are no quick fix solutions, but there are a series of small steps that can be taken to vastly improve the situation, and in particular the issue of legal due process and the enforcement of criminal law. It's my turn now to make a contribution to this debate, and first of all let me say it's an honour to address such a large audience, but my thoughts are on the lines that there can be no doubt that religious extremism is the prime security challenge of our times. We only have to recall the events of 9/11 almost a decade ago to this month, as it were, to remind ourselves of the way in which terrorism, driven by religious fanaticism and our response to it subsequently in the West, can transform so many areas of public and private life. The days of conventional security threats, which I grew up with as a young boy and young man in my formative years politically, as the principal existentialist danger to our society, are long past. Yes, nuclear weapons and hostile states still exist, as they did during the Cold War, but religious extremism is, in my view, more dangerous in some ways because it's an asymmetric threat. It cannot be defined by borders or nationality. It is thus not confined neatly to a single nation state. neither can a traditional Cold War doctrine, which went by the rather unfortunate acronym of MAD, for Mutual Assured Destruction, be relied on when the enemy doesn't fear their own death or mass destruction. Some countries, through their misguided policies, I have to say, turn a blind eye to the growth of religious extremism in the dangerous belief it can be used as an external arm against their enemies or as part of a compact that exports these threats away from their domestic territory. Who exactly is the enemy? Where is the enemy? In our globalised world, these questions are almost impossible to answer, and this lack of clarity has permeated our very psyche in Europe. We rightly laud democracy as the apotheosis of political development. We rightly proclaim human rights as the foundations of a just and humane society. We cherish the rule of law as a guarantor of society's freedoms, and we continue to insist that these pillars of modern European society are the best possible antidote to religious extremism. Yet the fact remains that religious extremism, and in particular the hardline and perverted brand of Islam that the vast majority of Muslims deplore, represents a clear and present danger to our democratic ideals. I should qualify my remarks by pointing out that Europe itself has a long history of religious extremism, characterised almost exclusively by sectarian divisions within Christianity. Catholics were persecuted after the Reformation in England, and Protestants by the Inquisition. The Crusades were also launched from European soil. We should not ignore these facts historically. We should not try to claim some kind of moral superiority as Europeans. But we must also need to understand that extremism today is not confined exclusively to any one religion. Most religions have extremist fringes who can turn to violence, and which are often linked to the championing of certain territorial disputes, such as the quest for a Sikh homeland, or even ethical issues such as abortion for certain Christian fundamentalists. However, sadly today, for the most part, the most dangerous and widespread examples of religious fanaticism can be found in certain hardline Islamist jihadi sects, although I reiterate these elements should not be conflated with Islam as a whole or the wider Muslim world. However, it is in fundamentalist political Islam that we see most clearly the crossover from violent words to violent actions, from inciting violence to actually killing innocent people, which is why we have entitled, somewhat controversially, today's conference as Murder in the Name of God. The security threat to the West posed by Islamist terrorism has pervaded all aspects of our lives. This is obvious in places like EU airports, with ever enhanced security checks or increased identification documentation required if we have to open a new bank account. Politically too, the decade since 9/11 and the attacks on the Twin Towers has been dominated by their aftermath. Soldiers from my constituency, London, have since served and died in Afghanistan and Iraq. The attacks in Madrid in 2004 and in London a year later, two cities that had previously suffered grievously from domestic IRA and ETA, Spanish bus terrorism, but these were both secular, and these had gone on for decades, but they were of a different sort of nature. They had a clear territorial intent, suddenly brought home for the first time to ordinary Europeans the reality of religion-based terrorism. We are now living in this shadow. What should our response be in Europe? We have heard some very useful suggestions and recommendations from the learned panel so far. But for the past decade, governments across Europe have wrestled with how to combat fanaticism while preserving at the same time the hard-won freedom of liberal democracies. The issue of the exact length of detention without charge for terrorist suspects caused a huge debate in the UK. Politicians tended to take a more intellectual and philosophical approach than perhaps members of the public, some of whom were probably happy to see terrorist suspects detained without charge for 42 years, let alone 42 days. And this was all a major debate under the previous UK Labour government. We also had a very lengthy debate about the use of identity cards in the United Kingdom and in almost all countries in Europe. This is not a major civil rights issue, but in Britain, with no tradition of ID cards, we and particularly my party and the Liberals in government, we decided against that as a step too far. But governments across Europe have tried also in a major way to integrate the Muslim minorities better into the mainstream in order to minimise the danger of alienation and radicalisation. However, it, in my view, remains still unclear for now as to how well language courses, citizenship classes and such like actually work in practice. It is also important to understand that in today's globalised world, it is easier than ever for immigrants generally, if they so wish, to remain totally detached from the host country mainstream society. This is largely thanks to cheap travel back to their countries of origin, the internet, as mentioned by John, and satellite television. I'll give you an example myself as an MEP. After 12 years' presence here in Belgium, I live in a kind of Anglosphere bubble in Brussels, reading daily UK papers, watching British TV and returning home every weekend, and thus sadly rarely have direct contact with the Belgians. Such a lifestyle 50 years ago, prior to modern technology, would have been impossible. It is a paradox of globalisation that I don't think our so-called open society has yet fully grasped, but sometimes third-generation descendants of immigrant families can more easily lead a more separate life from the host culture, if they so choose, than their grandparents did when they first arrived in Europe. As I mentioned, we tend to lionise our democratic and progressive European society as a powerful tool in the fight against extremism, as if somehow our values will naturally prevail by virtue of their obvious rectitude, and that they will triumph over violence and destruction represented by religious fanaticism. We also tend to believe that our societies, by virtue of their openness, tolerance of different views and protection of free speech, will automatically act as a buffer against extremism. However, the row over the pictorial representations of the Prophet Muhammad in the Danish newspapers exposed an uncomfortable truism that freedom of expression has to some extent been stifled by the violent threats of extremism. Who wants to live in a fortress for the rest of your life for having drawn an offensive cartoon? Admittedly, the publication of these cartoons was a gratuitously offensive and provocative act, but so too, in my view, was the decision by some Islamist extremists in the United Kingdom to hold up placards celebrating the death of British soldiers in Afghanistan as their bodies were being repatriated for burial. So not surprisingly, some people perceive Europe's liberal traditions of unquestioning tolerance as facilitating this kind of extremism. And another unsurprising consequence of all of this is the rise of far-right parties, and in fact several of them sit here in this Parliament across Europe, which are themselves extremist and fanatical in their own thinking. The sickening events in Norway over the summer show how some disturbed individuals will use radicalism as an excuse for their own murderous and nihilistic atrocities. In today's globalised world, connected by the internet, it is virtually impossible for states to isolate their citizens from extremist ideas. However, far from seeking to prevent extremism from taking root, some countries do too little, either directly or indirectly, to stem the growth of extremist thinking, both in their own countries domestically and abroad. Saudi Arabia, via certain Islamic charities, operating from its own soil, for example, is a well-known supporter of hardline Wahhabi ideas, both at home and abroad. In my constituency of London, there was a famous case of the King Saud Academy in Ealing, funded by the Saudi royal family, which distributed textbooks disgracefully labelling Jews as monkeys and Christians as pigs. I recently, 2 weeks ago, met the Ethiopian Prime Minister, Meles Zenawi, who complained bitterly about Saudi money being used to build Wahhabi-inspired madrasas in his country, which were radicalising Ethiopia's Muslim minority that have traditionally coexisted peacefully for centuries with the Christian majority. If you go to Macedonia in the Western Balkans, a country I am very familiar with, as I did this year, and in the largely Albanian Muslim north, and Roma, who are also Muslim by faith, you will see a proliferation of Saudi and Gulf Islamic charity-funded mosques amongst the only new buildings often in the region, and Islamist networks are providing welfare according to the Dawa model, easily displacing a weak and cash-strapped central government. Allegedly, men are being paid to sport beards, as are women to wear veils, amongst an Albanian community which has always been in the past historically secular. Moreover, Islamism in northern Macedonia is being conflated with a renascent brand of greater Albanian nationalism, which is a potentially incendiary concoction that could yet lead to renewed conflict in a region of Europe that remains desperately fragile politically, and similar processes are occurring in Bosnia-Herzegovina. I have discussed the way religious extremism is shaping Europe's society and challenging its cohesion, but it is important to realise as well that religious persecution is an everyday fact of life for many minority communities living in majority Muslim countries. I have campaigned in this Parliament and made my name, to a certain extent, strongly as a defender of these minorities' rights to peaceably live and practice their faith. The Assyrian Christians in Iraq, the Baha'is in Iran, the Coptic Christians in Egypt, the Ahmadiyas in Pakistan, for instance. In fact, Pakistan offers us an object lesson in the destabilising and debilitating effects of allowing religious extremism to flourish. Part of the problem is that discrimination is openly written into the country's legal Sharia-based code. Pakistan's blasphemy and Ahmadiyya banning laws institutionalise discrimination and therefore sanction intolerance. Those who bravely call for a change in these laws, as the late governor of Punjab, Salman Taseer, did, often have to pay with their lives. We were to have a daughter to address us, but unfortunately, because her brother has recently been abducted, again mysteriously, she wasn't able to come. The Ahmadiyya community in Pakistan live under constant threat, both legal and populist, but we can also see the way in which the situation in Pakistan can affect us over here in Europe, on the other side of the world. Recently, I am told, some Ahmadiyya residents living in London received death threats from so-called mainstream British Muslims accusing them of apostasy. In contrast, I was in Bangladesh 3 years ago for an observation mission which I headed of MEPs and was impressed how, unlike Pakistan, it democratically threw out the Islamist Jamaat party from parliament. Bangladesh, to its credit, has established a modern secular government and a tolerant free press in which space is given to minorities, from Hindus to Buddhists, from Christians to Ahmadiyyas, to practice freely without fear of persecution. It is also worrying, as has been mentioned, to see the increase in attacks against the Ahmadis in Indonesia, a country otherwise known for its economic miracle and successful democratic transition and great traditions of tolerance in the past. Let us hope that the Indonesian authorities act swiftly to counteract pockets of extremism that now seem to be surfacing. The European Parliament recently sought to highlight this worrying trend through a resolution I was co-author to. I strongly believe, and this is one of my suggestions, that the European Union should use its enormous clout in third country free trade and developmental aid programmes to make respect for fundamental human rights a condition of the agreements, and if these are flouted or ignored, the EU should suspend these agreements without any further ado. I have been privileged in the recent years to develop very good links with the Ahmadis in London and in the UK generally. And of course I thank the all-party group today for sponsoring this conference. The Ahmadi community is a resourceful, courageous and determined community. Its slogan, as has been mentioned by its president, love for all, hatred for none, is the very antithesis of the hatred and violence perpetrated by a minority of jihadi radicals. I would like to think that this message could gradually moderate the extremist elements rather than lead to their continued victimisation of the bearers of this message of peace and hope. So what is the answer to the pressing problem of religious extremism in Europe? That is partly what today's discussion is about. We have had a number of interesting ideas thrown up. I got some ideas too, but I certainly do not have all the answers. However, two things to me are clear. Firstly, the answer to Islamist extremism needs to come above all from within reformist Muslim currents if it is to be credible and lasting. For instance, the tolerant and mystical Sufi traditions which prevailed for centuries in Central Asia and North Africa need to re-establish themselves in opposition to the extremist and intolerant Salafists with their links to Al-Qaeda. Second, Europe needs to face up to the unprecedented nature of this threat and be prepared to take the necessary measures to retain our free, progressive and equal society. Tolerating a flourishing in our own societies of hardline intolerant voices cannot be the right path. That European society is being tested as never before is a fact, and once we have lost our cohesion as a society based around our own cherished values, we are very unlikely to ever win them back. Thank you very much. The floor to anybody who wishes to ask any questions or make any comments or helpful suggestions. So who would like to be brave enough to start off? If you do speak, could you please introduce yourself, saying your name and what organisation, if any, you belong to? Gentleman there with his hand up.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Assalamu alaikum to everybody. My name is Khalil Yusuf and I am from London. I'm a proud member, a humble member of the Ahmadiyya Muslim community. I just want to make a few comments, if I may. 1947, 1953, 74, 84, 93. These are all key dates in the history of Pakistan and our community. I won't rehearse the background to all of them here today, other than to say that Pakistan began as a secular nation. In 1953, we were completely exonerated by the judicial Munir report. But in 1984, when Ordinance 20 was put in place by General Zia-ul-Haq, any likeness with Islam or any practice of Islam by any Ahmadi Muslim was criminalised. In 1993, the Supreme Court likened Islam to the Coca-Cola brand, saying that the intellectual property in Islam belonged to other Muslims and that we were not entitled to associate with it. Today in Pakistan, we have a democracy in which Ahmadis cannot vote. They cannot get a passport. They cannot register their marriages without renouncing their faith. I ask this conference today, what democracy when 4 million Ahmadis cannot vote? Today, mullahs occupy what I call a pulpit of poison. It is a virus that was once an infection that has now become an epidemic, and which I now say we must prevent from becoming a pandemic. These extremists believe that no other religion than their own firebrand form of Islam can exist. Not Ahmadi, not Shia, not Christian, not Hindu or Jew. And where does it come from? Well, predominantly it comes from a group called Jamaat-e-Islami, formed by an individual called Maulana Maududi, which Lord Eric Avery mentioned in his video address today. What do they say about themselves? I quote to you from their constitutional document, from their book. Jamaat-e-Islami is not a missionary organisation or a body of preachers or evangelists, but an organisation of God's troopers. This is from Maulana Maududi's book, Haqiqatul Jihad, which means the truth about jihad, on page 58. They want Sharia law, and they want Ahmadis who they regard as wajibul qatl, which means liable to be killed, to in fact be killed. I want to give you one other brief quote as well. This is also from their book. They say that they want Islamic revolution, not just in Pakistan, but worldwide. I quote, all Muslims will be required to declare their faith as Muslim within 1 year of an Islamic revolution. They will be bound to practice Islam. That's their form of Islam. Those who refuse and cannot be saved will be executed. This is from a book called Murtad Ki Saza, Islam Ke Qanoon Mein, page 80 to 81. I will try and be brief. Ordinance 20 criminalises the existence of Ahmadi Muslims and also Christians. People are subjected to magnetic speeches by mullahs which result in their death. And I have before you just a list of some of these people who have been murdered as a result of all of these actions. Just take all of that. Hundreds of Ahmadis have been murdered, and many more hundreds have been persecuted. Just recently, Ahmadi children as young as 10 years old were imprisoned for many months on the charge of blasphemy. This is apartheid, modern-day apartheid. That's not just rhetoric. That is as close a definition as it can be to the 2002 Rome Statute of the International Criminal Court. Well, what is it that we can do today? The EU has pledged a 10-fold increase in aid, from 7 million to 72 million to Pakistan. 485 million preceding that in order to deal with extremism. It is my view that foreign policy of the EU will be undermined if Pakistan is continued to be allowed to promote extremism. I want to give you one final quote and close with this. This is a document which is taken from the Home Office website and is about a list of banned groups. And I want to read you a description of one banned group. The aim of both SSP and LEJ is to transform Pakistan by violent means into a Sunni state under the control of Sharia law. Another objective is to have all Sharia declared kafirs and to promote the destruction of other religions, notably Judaism, Christianity and Hinduism. This is exactly the task of Jamaat-e-Islami and Khatm-e-Nubuwwat. This is exactly what they want to achieve. And I put before you policy leaders today that any such group that is being established in Britain or anywhere in Europe must also be subject to a ban. We cannot allow intolerance to breed within Europe or Britain or anywhere else. And this is no rhetoric. I believe that here today, you policy leaders can be the founding fathers of a new freedom in which the apartheid in Pakistan can be removed. We must restore the rights to Ahmadi Muslims and Christians and let freedom be the preserve of every man, woman and child. Thank you for listening to me.
Well, thank you very much. That was a wonderful speech. Could the next speaker make it a little shorter, because time is very much of the essence? I saw the gentleman at the back first, and then this gentleman, that gentleman. Okay, gentleman at the back first, with the red jumper. Yes.
Yeah. Thank you so much. There has been an emphasis.
Can you say who you are first?
Sorry, my name is Ali Usman Qasmi, and I'm a postdoctoral fellow at Royal Holloway College. There has been emphasis on the role played by Saudi Arabia in the promotion of madrasas, and I was wondering what kind of a policy European Union and the British government has towards Saudi Arabia, which is being labelled as the main promoter of religious intolerant ideology across the Muslim world. And secondly, what about the British-sponsored studies which emphasize that the faith-based organizations can be useful in bringing about change in the Muslim world, and there are proposals that madrasas in fact should be incorporated for a strategy whereby a more moderate version of Islam should be promoted in Pakistan and elsewhere?
Well, I will try and answer that. I certainly can't speak for the British government because I'm only a humble member of the European Parliament. But Saudi Arabia, of course, poses quite a considerable challenge, because it's on the one hand, a bit like Pakistan is part of the war on terror, as it were, as an indispensable ally of the Americans for what's going on in Afghanistan. Saudi Arabia is also seen as a loyal ally of the West in preventing Iranian Shia expansionism and nuclear acquisition in the Gulf. And so, on the one hand, they are extremely helpful in that respect, and I think King Abdullah himself is a very moderate man, although the succession, when he dies, to Prince Naif is actually quite worrying. But you're absolutely right, and as I pointed out in my own speech, at the same time they turn a blind eye to the proliferation of Wahhabi-financed madrasas, not just in the Arabian Peninsula, but fairly globally, including parts of Europe, as I mentioned. And I think this is sort of almost sort of double think that goes on within the Saudi establishment. They can do both at the same time, and that they'll get away with it, is a huge challenge. And I think the only way to, as it were, address this is to constantly remind them of the fact that if they want to contain Shia fundamentalism through Iran, they also shouldn't be exporting any kind of Sunni fundamentalism through the Wahhabi views of many of the royals and many of the wealthy Saudi donors. So this is the kind of conflict that many of us who are in the area of foreign policy and human rights have to face. On the one hand, we welcome Saudi participation in certain issues, but we also reject their hardline brand of intolerance, which they're exporting to countries, as I said, from Macedonia to parts of South Asia. So that's all I can say. Anybody else wants to try and address that? Perhaps, do you have any views on Saudi Arabia?
I can't speak for the British government or the European Union. What I can say is that, to relate to your second question, the British government's approach to certain groups who operate under an Islamist mantle has changed in the last 2 years, and there's much more sophistication when it comes to responding to those groups and the identity of those groups and to the real agenda of those groups. So while, if you like, the cat is out of the bag, and this is an issue which people were slow to pick up on, the response to it is increasingly sophisticated, I would say that, if not perfect at this moment in time.
Right, another question. I think this gentleman here caught my eye.
Thank you. My name is Dr. Nabil Mustafa, and I'm not a follower of the Ahmadiyya faith, but I would like to express my abhorrence at what I heard of the atrocities that happened, especially recently, both in Indonesia and Pakistan, and I don't condone this. However, I would like also to speak as chairman of Elmbridge Multi-Faith Forum in Esher in England, and also as a Baha'i. And I feel that the time has come for us to look at two aspects of the problem. First of all, I don't think it is enough to talk about increasing tolerance. I think this tolerance business is not a very effective way. I would like to see a very systematized way of increasing integration within societies, both in the West and, more importantly, in the East. And I'm not excluding Saudi Arabia, because in Saudi Arabia there is absolutely no integration between the various factions of the society. But I'm just giving this as an example. We have the I'm chairman of the Multi-Faith Forum. I think that's a good work, but it's not enough, because I would like to see as an expression of good practice in every local authority, for example, to have a program for integration and cohesion within its boundaries, because that to me is more important. It's a step further than just saying tolerance. Tolerance is a very passive word. We really need to go towards integration. And I think that all the policies of the European community should include a very important consideration, and that is how much integration there is within societies, within communities, within aspects of the communities, within all the countries that have relationships, whether economic, political, military, or whatever. I think I'd like to take it, as I said, tolerance to me is not enough anymore. It is integration. Thank you.
I think, Rafi, you'd like to say a few words? Press the button. The light should come on. Is it coming on? No, it seems to. Use my mic. Yeah. Lean over.
I think, firstly, thank you very much for your views. But on this issue of integration, I would like to point out that the 7/7 bombers were well integrated into the society. Some of them were football-playing school teachers. Therefore, integration alone is not going to be enough. You know, I think it is very, very important. One thing that we continue to advise the UK authorities, that it is the extreme fundamentalists who are given free permission to come into the UK and in Europe as well, who come and preach their form of extremism to the people of that country. They have to be stopped. And also in terms of media, whether it's the internet or whether it is, as I said, if you go now on Sky platform, you'll find there are 20 Islamic channels, all giving their own brand of Islam. And a number of them, Ummah channel, Takbir channel, they have already been informed to the authorities that they are preaching extreme views, including Wajib al-Qatl. You know, this has been openly on the air. They have preached that. The problem is that the authorities are reluctant to take strong action against them. They want to give them the freedom of speech aspect, and therefore they allow them to speak openly. But unfortunately, that is damaging the society. And we somehow, as governments, have to make decisions what we want to do. Whether, yes, it is important to have freedom of speech, but there has got to be a time when you've got to say, no, that's enough, no more.
Thank you very much. The lady here at the front.
I'm Rashna Master from Elmbridge Multi-Faith. I'm also a Parsi Zoroastrian. I'd just like to say, and I know it may be very naive, but I think we all as human beings need to value life. And until we can individually value life, and until we put that at the top of the agenda, we're never going to change. For many years, people talk about religion, they talk about war, everything is the name of religion. And really, we're not really talking about religion. We're just talking about territory. We're talking about money, greed, all these things. So we just need to get back to basics and talk about life. And we are all human beings. If we were attacked from outer space, we would stick together. So why can't we just go back to basics and just talk about the value and the respect for individual life?
Well, thank you for that comment. That's absolutely true. Can I just remind speakers to turn off their microphones to avoid the echo? I see a lady right at the back there.
Thank you. Rubina Greenwood from World Sindhi Congress and Sindh Delegation and EU. Just a little suggestion. One solution lies in strengthening the 40 million Sufi secular nation of Sindhis in Pakistan, a nation that has historically been against extremism and been inclusive of all faiths and religion that live in this soil. We ask EU to help and support the nation of Sindh, which is suffering in Pakistan and by jihadi journals, and has a high number of Ahmadis, Hindus, Dalits, and Christians in Sindh. Thank you.
Thank you for that comment from the Sindh delegation. This gentleman here.
My name is Nauman Aman Hadi. I'm a 16-year-old student, and my question is that are you in full support of our actions in dealing with the extremists? After all, we are seeing extremism rise. So could there be a fault in the way that we are dealing with the extremists? As respected President Saib mentioned, that we are seeing this extremism moving into Europe as well. And when speaking with students my age, I find that they are angry and they are retaliating by what some of the invasions of Iraq and Afghanistan. So are you in support of every single action that the West has taken?
Well, I'm never in support of every single action of anything or anybody. Everything has to be judged on its own merits. And are we taking the issue seriously enough? I think we are. Are we prosecuting those who are inciting violence or inciting religious or any other kind of hatred sufficiently well in our own societies across Europe? I suspect not. I think that's partly because of the nervousness and delicacy of the whole issue, because for decades there was this doctrine of multiculturalism, that every religion, every faith, every minority had to pursue its own cultural objectives within its own community, and that shouldn't be in any way criticised. I think that there has been a change of thinking after the terrorist attacks, particularly both in America but also in Europe, that integration is much more important, that we need to identify those who are breaking the law, and they need to be isolated, they need to be prosecuted if necessary. And I think one of the problems, of course, is that many mainstream politicians, we don't speak the languages. I mean, the only people that do, of course, come from their own communities, Urdu and Arabic and what have you, and they are often intimidated and frightened to stand up and name and shame those who are advocating violence against their own communities or other communities or whatever. So it is a very delicate issue. I think we are at least now able to discuss it and debate it in a more open and free fashion. A few years ago, even talking about these things would have been difficult for me as a British politician to raise the topics. I think we have at least progressed to the period where there is a more open debate on how to resolve this, because one thing we don't want to do, and I am a father of young children, is lead a legacy for future generations of strife, division and bloodshed in our own societies. That just cannot be the way ahead. So we don't have all the answers, but we certainly begin to ask some of the questions. The chap there put his hand up.
Thank you, sir. My name is Abel Zouani, France Media. I am not Ahmadi. My opinion is Ahmadi Muslim community is a community to peace. I am Sunnite from Algeria. Ahmadi Muslim community is a community of love. Al-Qaeda is a criminal organization, but George Bush, Tony Blair is a big terrorist for Iraq. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Actually, I actually meant the gentleman there, actually, who was meant to be... sorry, I got distracted. You were the chap who was supposed to talk and speak. Thanks, sorry.
Hello.
Could you say who you are first?
Yes, my name is Abdulhak Kompier. I'm a physician working in the Netherlands and a member of the Ahmadiyya community. What I wanted to raise is the issue of Western governments funding fundamentalist and terrorist groups. For example, a very well-known example is the funding of the Taliban against the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan. And also Osama bin Laden was part of the people who were funded at that time to fight the Soviets. At that time, the Western governments weren't thinking about what these organizations are doing with their money and power that they were given by the Western governments. Other examples are that the fighters of Al-Qaeda were also funded to fight against the Is this working? Okay. So also the Al-Qaeda fighters were being funded to fight the Serbs in Kosovo. And right now, the same Al-Qaeda fighters who were killing the American soldiers in Iraq are being funded to fight President Gaddafi in Libya. And we are not thinking about what the ideas of these rebels are that we are funding. We are also not thinking about the genocide against the blacks that they have carried out in Libya. Also, talk has been about the Salafi movement and the Wahhabis of the Saudi government. The Wahhabi movement was funded in the 19th century by British intelligence to subvert the Muslim world in order to facilitate the British rule there. And the Saudi government has been placed there by
Okay, well, I think it's probably enough on that issue, because I don't think we can look backwards in history at the wrong examples and wrong choices we've made. I think coming much nearer to the present period, 1979, when the West backed the Mujahideen in Afghanistan against the Soviet Union in the Cold War, and we created a monster which we now can't control. So it's easy to be wise after the event. So whatever the British did in the 19th century in the Arabian Peninsula, I can't be held accountable for that, I'm afraid. What we do know now is that this is an issue which faces all of us in the West, in South Asia, in the Far East, in Indonesia, and wherever, and we need to find contemporary solutions. So many hands going up and so little time. I believe the gentleman from the Pakistani mission to the European Union, and I'm not sure whether you're the ambassador or representing them. My name is Ayub, and I'm Deputy Head of Mission from the Pakistani mission to the European Union. Would like to respond to some of the criticisms made of your country, sir. All been cut. Mine's still working. I don't know whether we've got any technicians here on hand to fix the problem. No. If you can come and speak up here, they're still working up here. And none of the mics working anywhere on the row. Gosh. Strange. I have to end it pretty soon. Too many questions. Pressing it?
मीर साहब नहीं करेंगे वो करेगा तो वो करेगा तो वही
It's working now. Okay, come and address from here, as Pakistan is so central to the debate. You can take my chair.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you, Chair. Just a few reflections on the points which were raised this evening. First of all, it's really incomprehensible for me to understand that you, Chair, completely ignored the fact that Salman Taseer was a senior and most important official working in the capacity, working in the government sector, and whatever he said or did for the rights of minorities, he actually was reflecting the aspirations of the people. He was following the policy of the government, and in him, the people and government of Pakistan lost a moderate voice. I am also surprised, and actually it's a news for me to hear that 4 million Ahmadis can't vote in Pakistan. It's not based on fact. No religion will permit murder in the name of God. Fanatics and bigots use religion to spread hatred and violence. These fanatics are not restricted to one religion or region. Human rights situation is not perfect in any country in the world. Europe has its own share of intolerance, which poses a threat not only to peace and harmony in Europe, but also has its negative consequences for the peace and harmony world over. Growing discrimination on racial and religious grounds has engulfed several European societies. Sadly, these societies fail to recognize and address the root causes of this problem. Negative stereotypes, discrimination against ethnic and religious minorities, xenophobia, defamation and stigmatization of religion, including incitement to ethnic and religious hatred by some political parties and leaders and media, lead to targeting of individuals and communities in some European countries. These incidents are very well documented. There is need to be aware of the discrimination of Roma people in Europe, which constitute Europe's largest ethnic minority. There is also need to doing away with the double standards, also with regard to protections of rights of Kashmiris and Palestinians. For the West to be taken seriously on human rights, it first needs to put its policies straight and its own house in order. The democratic government of Pakistan has embarked on a reform process. This process is going on at full pace, which unfortunately panelists either are not aware of or deliberately chose to ignore. Pakistan has a sovereign parliament, an independent judiciary, a free media, and a vibrant civil society, which are acting as custodian of human rights and fundamental freedoms for all. We fully agree there is need for improvement. Government of Pakistan is fully conscious of its obligations. We take the observations made this evening about any shortcomings very seriously, but any notion that Ahmadiyas as community have been subject to human rights violation in Pakistan is completely devoid of facts. Any isolated incidents in Pakistan cannot be characterized as religious violence against particular minorities. As a matter of fact, such incidents were terrorist Okay.
Please let the diplomat speak first.
As a matter of fact, such incidents were the fallout of the ongoing war against terrorism and extremism. Pakistan has been playing a central role in the fight against terror, and the attack was a fallout, as I just pointed out. And this fight has cost Pakistan thousands of innocent lives and billions of dollars. Extremism and terrorism are our common enemy, requiring common efforts. Unjustified allegations may not help the cause, but to strengthen the hands of those we are fighting against. It is, therefore, our common responsibility to develop an international environment which discourages violence and promotes protection for all. Thank you very much.
Well, I have to say, I never shoot the messenger, but the message clearly is one that I can't fully accept, because my understanding, and correct me if I'm wrong, Ahmadis are actually banned by law from practicing their faith. So that speaks volumes. I think one 19th century British politician said the definition of a diplomat is a man who's sent abroad to lie for his country, and it's obviously extremely difficult being a Pakistani diplomat faced with the issue of the Ahmadiyya community in Pakistan, because it's quite clear the facts speak for themselves. Your community is discriminated against. Whether or not you can vote, I don't know. The Pakistani envoy claims you can. I tend to believe what you say, not what he has to say. And I think the issue, I have no doubt as well that many Pakistanis, of course, have been the victims of terrorism, and there's been a terrible fight. But there's also been people at the very highest levels of the military and the inter-services intelligence who have sympathised with their homegrown Lashkar terrorists that they've created in the war against India, sadly. And the fact that Osama bin Laden lived there for 5 years under the very noses of a military garrison speaks volumes. So whatever you say about Pakistan, it's a very complex society. It's a very important country. I don't deny any of that. But there are certainly clear problems vis-à-vis human rights, and also their total commitment at the highest levels to fighting terrorism. But I'll just have one more question before we close. Can I recognise Ribal al-Assad, who's over there from London?
Yes. Sorry, my name is Ribal al-Assad. I'm the chairman of the Iman Foundation.
I think one. Okay. Sit here. Does that one work at the end?
Oh, yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, that one's okay. Thank you. Keep it on now.
It's gone.
Don't go near it, yeah.
Sorry. My name is Ribal al-Assad, the chairman of the Iman Foundation, which promotes dialogue to strengthen understanding between the MENA and the EU countries and to challenge extremism. I am delighted to be here to support the Ahmadi community here today. We have launched a campaign to say no to extremism and sectarianism in the Middle East and North Africa. We are going to highlight to EU politicians, policymakers and governments, and give evidence of preachers of hate and violence. For example, the Chief Justice of the Saudi Chief Justice of Supreme Committee, Mr. Sheikh Al-Luhaydan, and the some television channels which are aired from Saudi Arabia and others from Egypt, which promote hatred and violence and incite hatred and violence against some Muslims around the world, which is completely unacceptable. So yes, Saudi is an ally, but we would like them to change, and as Mr. Tannock said before, that King Abdullah have done a lot of good things, and he's a great promoter of interfaith and intrafaith dialogue, but there are elements in Saudi Arabia who apparently are backing those Wahhabis or Salafis, and we have all to stand together in challenging those extremism wherever they are in the world. Thank you very much.
I now have to start. I'm sorry, I can't take any more questions. We're already running 5 minutes late. Could I ask Tuna, who's a very experienced and wise parliamentarian, to make some closing remarks and to try and summarise some of the very helpful suggestions that have been made by both the speakers and members of the audience. The floor is yours, Tuna.
Thank you, Charles, and thank you all. I represent Estonia in this parliament. We don't have a mosque yet. But I think for me it was very interesting and instructive meeting. And first of all, I thank you all for coming here today. Special welcome to Ahmadiyya community, because for me this is a historic visit to the European Parliament, which is in a way a conscience of the world. We are reacting to all human rights violations over the world, and your presence of everyone here today is important, that you are here, because you are embodying the message of freedom, friendship and tolerance on behalf of Islam. And jointly we have to face the same challenge, which is common for us, the challenge of extremism and violence. Now, it has been said that extremism mostly is based upon ideology, and on the other hand of modern Western technology on the internet. I think this is an important message to understand the situation, how easily this extremism could spread all over the world, over the boundaries of states. Now, Islam too, you say, has a message of love and peace. I think the trouble is that Islam, Christianity too, doesn't have only one highest authority, but there's no highest authority to interpret Islam in an authoritative way. That is a problem. Now the problem too is freedom of religion for everyone, and this includes not only freedom to practice your religion, but also freedom to change your religion, to spread your views in an oral or written form. I think this is a major problem in many countries of Asia and Middle East. It was mentioned that Pakistan started as a secular state, and the founder of Pakistan, Jinnah, embraced, in fact, all religions and all minorities. There's a big way now to a negative change, and I think we all share the view that the Pakistani representative did not respond in a convincing way to the problem, especially persecutions of Ahmadiyas. Now the main question is the measures, what to take, and these have to be only common measures. First of all, awareness. I think this is the main message, to be aware of this specific problem. Next step could be solidarity. and I would say interaction of different political groups and religious groups using the same technical means, internet, to communicate with each other. Overcoming, I think very important, is overcoming mutually our prejudices, our separation from each other. And I think it would make sense to try to visit each other's churches, mosques, synagogues, to have much better understanding what we are standing for. And I think it becomes then much more clearer. I think one conclusion could be that Europe too, the old Europe, has to share part of responsibility for this, because our widespread moral relativism, our freedom without responsibility, which could be shocking for many representatives of Islam or other religions who come to Europe, seeing a consumer societies where everything goes, where there's no morals. Actually, this is insulting, and this is an environment also for protest and intolerance in reacting in a violent way, unfortunately. But at the same time, I think it is a very important message which was voiced from the audience, that fundamentalists who are traveling around have to be stopped, and obstacles should be made to their messages. And I think in the same way, local communities have to react to preaching violence in the form of fundamentalisms locally, whether it be in mosques or in churches or elsewhere. Saudi Arabia too has been mentioned as a basis for one of the bases of fundamentalism, and here the Western policies have to draw conclusions. But all in all, I think we can share the same message, that God is love, and you should love not only God but your neighbor. If we all implement this message, I think there will be no problems. This reminds me of the Indian religious reformer and freedom fighter from the end of the 19th century, Vivekananda, who tried to live 1 month according to Hinduism. He was Hinduist. Then according to Islam rules, and then according to Christian principles, and concluded that actually there's no difference between the three. And this also reminds me of my old friend, a Lutheran pastor from Estonia, who was imprisoned by Stalin for 10 years. He lived in extreme conditions, and he met Muslims from Uzbekistan and Central Asian countries. And he preached them the gospel. Only he substituted, when there was talk about the Sermon on the Mountain, the name Jesus with the name Muhammad, so they could agree upon everything. He was released, so they couldn't agree yet upon pardoning and forgiving. But this was a minor problem. So I think we need also, it was mentioned that the critics of extremism should be able to express their views freely and openly without being labelled as extremists themselves, as representatives of anti-Islam or whatever. And finally, I think we need an equal approach to react to all persecutions and suppressions of any religious group which is worth of this term, be it Muslim, be it Christian, or whatever religion. Only on this basis we could develop and achieve a measure of solidarity which would help us to resist extremism in any form. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you, Tuna, for those concluding remarks to what has been a very interesting, I think, conference. Yours are very fine and wise words from a very senior parliamentarian. I just have a few housekeeping announcements to make. There's going to be a reception downstairs on the ground floor between 7 and 8, and we can carry on with our discussions and question and answers. For those of you travelling back to the UK by coach, could you proceed to the main entrance? And could I finally thank both the Ahmadi Muslim community from the UK and the all-party group and other parts of Europe. I met an Ahmadi from Holland last night at dinner who told me about his as one of the first mosques built in that country. I'd like to also thank the sponsorship today from the South Asia Democratic Forum and Paula Kazaka, who's here representing them, a former member of this House. And lastly, to thank my own office staff, James and Laura, for all their hard work and making this possible today. So thank you and enjoy the rest of the evening, and salam alaikum. Rafiq would like to have a small prayer.
Normally it's traditional that we end with a silent prayer, and I request all of you to join us in a silent prayer. Go out. Ameen.